Hey everybody, it's Scott Shetler here at Extreme Performance Training Systems. Welcome to this week's episode of Strength and Health TV. This week I want to talk about the triceps and how they relate to the bench press. I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that I've kind of come across in my reading lately that kind of spurred on this video, as well as some of the things that I've done here with my lifters and athletes to help build their triceps and how that relates to their bench press. So I really got the idea to kind of talk about this in the video when I came across this article in this great book that I grabbed a while back. This book is called The Forgotten Secrets of the Culver City Westside Barbell Club Revealed. It's by Dave Yarnell, and it's basically a collection of all the old articles that came from the original Westside Barbell Club in Culver City, California, that was run by Bill West. So it's just a great book. I think you can find it on Amazon, but tons of amazing training information. And when you look at the dates that a lot of this stuff was published, it's just kind of mind-blowing to see really how far ahead of their time these guys were with the training information that they were putting out and the insane weights that they were lifting back then. The article that I came across was one that was talking about triceps development, and it was called I think it was called the Triceps Power Cheats, and it was it was written in Muscle Builder magazine back in October of '66, so it's quite some time ago. But again, the article was called Triceps Power Cheats, and basically what it talked about in the article was how the two lifters that the article profiled was Bill West and Pat Casey. And Pat was an amazing bencher. I think the first, don't quote me on this, but I think he was the first lifter in history to eclipse the 600-pound bench press barrier. But regardless, whatever's bench, he was very strong, very ahead of his time. And this talked about their favorite variations of what they called the power cheat and how they used it. So basically the power cheat was a combination of a pullover with a tricep extension. So if you visualize, you're laying down on the bench, and instead of just doing a tricep extension where you bring the bar down to maybe like your neck or your chin or your nose and then extend up for the triceps, what they were actually doing was bringing the bar down and then rolling back into a pullover and then using the lats to kind of shoot the weight up into the lockout. And both had their own favorite ways of doing it. West kind of preferred to set the bar on the bench behind him, and then he would grab the bar with a close grip, pull it over to his chest, get positioned, and then go from there. So he would pull over by lowering the bar back behind his head toward the bench, and then he would shoot the pullover until his arms were perpendicular, his upper arms were perpendicular to the ground, and then he would shoot the lockout up for the tricep. Pat Casey actually favored, he would actually take the bar out of the uprights of a bench and hold that at his chest, hook his feet under the bench and lay down, and then he would actually roll the bar back until it was almost touching the ground, so he would get an even bigger stretch and use a greater range of motion on the pullover, do the pullover and kick it up into the lockout, and then he would actually sit up with the weight that he was using on his chest and then put it back in the racks at a bench. So when I read off some of the weights that he was using, you'll be amazed, just at his abdominal strength as it related to getting rid of that weight. But the idea with the movement was that the pullover portion was allowing a big overload on the triceps. So instead of just doing a strict tricep press, which would limit the amount of weight that you could do, what you were able to do with the power cheat was to get a significant loading on the triceps by using that pullover to start the movement. So it allowed for a lot heavier loading. And so again, just to see what a typical workout was that was reported in this article, Bill West would typically start with 135 for 10, then he would go to 185 for 5, 205 for 5, 225 for 1, 255 for 1, and then he would do 6 total singles at 255. And I think the article the article said that he had even worked up to about 290 for a single. And this was done on a flat bench. Pat Casey, on the other hand, he did more of a pyramid with his workout, and he would typically go 135 for 10, 225 for 5, 275 for 5, 305 for 3. Then he would start his singles at 325 for 1, 340, 355, 370, and then he'd work his way back down, 325 for a single, 305 for a single, and then he would finish with a flush set of 275 for 8. So again, these were both done off of a flat bench. Casey preferred to go a little bit further back, almost touching the ground on the pullover portion of the power cheat, whereas West would go back to the bench just above his head to start the pullover portion to overload the tricep. The benefit to this in the bench press was that in bringing the lats into the movement with the pullover, people forget that the lats are crucial to the bench press. And the way the article described it is the lats started the bench by giving the triceps a shelf to kind of sit off of. So, when you talk about, these benchers, you hear these really good bench pressers talking about using the lats. Just building up big lats kind of created a shelf for the triceps. But also, when you go to press the weight, the lats are flaring to get that weight going off your chest as you transfer into the triceps for the lockout. So the lats are very important, and incorporating the pullover not only allows you to get a maximal loading on the tricep, but it also brings the lats into the movement as well. The second exercise of the workout, of the power cheat workout, was to go from a flat to an incline bench, and they preferred a steep incline. The article said 60 degrees. Now, the way that they would do these was Bill would bring the bar. He would take it out of the racks, or he would just clean it up to his chest and lay down on the incline bench. And Bill would take the bar from about forehead level, keeping his upper arm perpendicular to the ground, and from forehead level, he would just kick it straight up. So it was basically like a half press. So again, you got to remember you're at a really steep incline, a 60-degree incline, so you're almost upright as it is. You're having that bar right up there at your forehead, and then you're just kicking straight up, lowering the bar back down to the forehead, kicking straight up. Casey alternatively preferred to do these out of the rack, so he would set a steep incline, 60-degree incline up in the power rack, and then he would set the spot pins so that the spot pins were in line with his forehead. And Casey would actually set that bar on the pins and do bottoms-up presses out of the pin. But again, two different variations of doing it. Obviously, they were both effective. Just to give you an idea on the weights, Bill would do 135 for 10, 150 for 10, then he would do 170 for 7 sets. So it's an insane volume. Pat Casey, on the other hand, preferred just to do this more for the pump or the flush aspect of it, and he would do typically 225 for 7 for 6 sets, as this article reported. So huge volume. This is right after, so you're doing the flat power cheat exercise that I just described a minute ago, then moving on to the incline. Now this is after your main bench work, so this is after they've done their primary benching for the day, then they're moving on. This is their tricep work. So it's a huge amount of intensity and volume in this workout. And then after, they would do the incline work, so they go from the flat, they go to the incline, and then they would always finish with some pump or some flush work, as they called it. And one of the favorites that the article mentioned was a French press, where you're taking the barbell overhead and you're lowering it behind the head and you're locking it out overhead for the triceps. They would typically do 3 sets of 10. The article reported they would just use a 100-pound barbell, which compared to the weights that they were using on the two first exercises in the power cheats was a pretty light weight. So again, they were just doing it as a kind of a flushing exercise for the triceps. Much in the way a lot of my lifters like to do band push downs or high rep push downs at the end of a tricep workout for a couple sets of about 20 or 25. So I thought that article was really cool. The power cheats are something that we've been playing around with a little bit, and I think it, the one thing that it pointed out for me, or kind of reminded to me, was that it's important not just to do the single joint like the tricep extensions, the dumbbell rollbacks that we do, the push downs and things like that, where typically we're doing about maybe 3 to 6 sets of workout, or we're typically falling somewhere in the ballpark of about 50 to 80, sometimes 100 reps with those single joint tricep exercises. But I think the one thing that I pointed out, and it got me thinking about, was having that heavy exercise that allows for a high load on the triceps, so that you're not just relying on lighter weights and single joint exercises to build the triceps. So I think having that heavier, like the power cheats or some of the other exercises that I'll talk about in a second, to bridge the gap, between your strict bench press work and then your isolation, your strict tricep work, where the power cheats really fit the bill. Some of the lifters that I've worked with in the past who've done similar exercises, I had a 198 who benched 502, And one of his favorite exercises was to take a barbell and do something similar to the power cheat. He wouldn't quite roll back to a full pullover, but he would typically bring the bar down and roll it back over his face, and then he would kick it up, much like the Bill Weston and Pat Casey's power cheat exercises. He just wouldn't have as much of a pullover, but he would regularly work as a 502 bencher at 198. He would regularly work. Now this is in a shirt too, by the way. He would regularly work his triceps. He would do those barbell rollbacks for 185 was typical for doing multiple sets of 12, like maybe 3 or 4 sets of 12 at 185. And he did work up to 225 at one point, I think for something in the 5, 6, maybe 8 rep range, which is pretty big weight. And then I had another bencher who, or power lifter, who had a 400, I think he benched 405 raw in a contest. So without a shirt, he was a 405 bencher, and one of his favorite exercises, he did a lot of the barbell rollbacks. He was a big fan of dips, and he would do full dips with, I think, up to 4 plates for sets of 10 to 12. Which is pretty big. He had massive triceps, and dips really worked well for him, which is interesting because in the Culver City Westside book, they talked about how Pat Casey was a big fan of dips, and I remember reading Casey's book where it showed him doing massive weights with really big full range of motion dips, and according to this article, it had said that it really just ground up his shoulders and really didn't carry over to his bench much. But my lifter Derek actually had a pretty good carryover with dips. So I think, you know, the important thing there is that not every exercise is going to affect every lifter the same way. You know, something that might work for somebody might not work for somebody else, which is why I think it's pretty crucial to have a lot of variety in the exercises that you use. You know, if you try 10, 20 different things, you might find, you know, 5 or 6 things work for you, and a different 5 or 6 things work for somebody else. So it's really important when you're fine-tuning your training to really find and focus on the exercise that work for you, which is why, again, in a previous video, I talked about how I'm not a huge fan of programs. I'm more of a fan of finding out, you know, understanding the principles of training and then applying them to you and figuring out how they work with your strengths and your weaknesses. So those are 2 big, you know, more compound style exercises that work for some of my lifters. Now I've got another lifter who's very strong, who benched at 111 pounds in a shirt. He benched 275. He eventually made a raw press of 285 in a contest at 114. He made a shirted bench of 320 at 123, and he made a raw bench at 132 of 310. So he's a pretty big bencher for those lighter weight classes. He does hold elite totals at 114 and 123, and we're working on a 3rd weight class elite right now at 132. But he actually, he's a big fan of close grip benches. After his max effort benching, close grip benches for multiple sets of 4 to 6, sometimes working up to 8, seem to work really well for him for that kind of middle range exercise. And then he favors a lot of tricep work with either dumbbell rollback extensions, where you bring the dumbbell down to the shoulders, roll back to stretch the tricep and kick up from there, or doing kettlebell extensions. And what's interesting, what really worked for him was to do more of a static overcome by dynamic kettlebell extension, where instead of doing them on a bench and doing it like a regular tricep extension, he actually lays down on the ground, lowers the dumbbells, rolls them back till the mass of the kettlebell, till the mass of the kettlebell hits the ground and comes to a dead stop, and then he kicks up off of that dead stop position. And those really got his bench moving. I know that when he pressed that, when he did that 310 raw bench at 132 in a contest in 2012, one of his primary tricep exercises that he just kept going back to were those kettlebell extensions, where you let the kettlebell come to rest on the ground and then you blasted it up from that static position. So those worked really, really well for him. I know my 502 at 198 bencher, my 405 bencher, I think Derek did that 405 at 242 if I'm not mistaken. They favored those static overcome by dynamic kettlebell tricep extensions as well. So that was a great more single joint exercise. But again, we were able to get that roll back, where when you would bring the kettlebells down, you roll back a little bit, you know, stretch the lats a little bit, the kettlebell hits the ground above the head, and then you kick up from that paused position. They did really well with that, particularly David going 310 at 132 in a contest. And that was one that seemed to work for him. There's other triceps that didn't quite work well for him. Overhead stuff like French presses doesn't work really well for him because he's got really poor mobility in his shoulder. I know Malcolm would do a lot of overhead kettlebell pressing. He liked seesaw presses and just sitting on a bench doing kettlebell shoulder presses. Those seem to work really well for him. And I don't remember if Derek did a whole lot of overhead work. Maybe some barbell presses here and there, but dips tended to be a good kind of a good heavy loading exercise in between his regular bench, his max effort bench work, and his tricep exercises. So again, those are just some of the exercises that have worked for some of my guys, and I think, like I said, it's important for you to go back and really try some of these different exercises and see what works for you. But I was glad that I came across that article on the Triceps Power Cheats, from the original Westside Barbell Club book, just because it did remind me that it is important to have some exercises that allow for some really, really heavy loading of the triceps, and not just to focus on single joint work all the time. And I'm not saying you shouldn't do the single joint work, and I'm not saying you shouldn't do the specific pec or the delt work, but triceps are overlooked, and I think finding exercises that kind of bridge the gap between the bench press and how you utilize the triceps and the bench at the lockout are really, really important. And I definitely encourage you, if you haven't tried those power cheats where it's just you're taking a bar and you're lowering it back and doing a pullover and then rolling it up into a full tricep extension. Give it a shot for a few weeks and see what type of development you get out of it. See if it carries over your bench press. But again, it's always good to think outside the box a little bit, try some new things, see how they impact your lift. And of course, if they get your lift moving, keep them, work them into your rotation. If they don't do anything for you, get rid of it and try something else. But hopefully this video gave you some ideas on some things that you could do for tricep training, and hopefully it'll get you to maybe look at some of those older articles. I think it's really important to go back and look at what the strong guys, from the older days did, because when you look at some of the weights that they were doing, is pretty massive. And especially when you consider powerlifting gear was not a factor back then. There were no bench shirts. There were no squat suits, and I think when squat suits came on the scene, they offered minimal assistance, if any. I know guys talk about getting like 20 pounds out of those suits, and they were more of a pain in the ass to wear than anything. Not like the gear that we have nowadays. Belts, they didn't have the big, thick 13 mil, 4-inch wide power belts. They would typically use Olympic weightlifting belts and just turn them around, so you had the wider part around the belly. Wraps were typically ace bandages. So when you look at raw lifters nowadays, having the big 4-inch, the big thick 4-inch power belts, the big heavy duty wrist wraps, the 3-meter knee wraps, it was certainly different back then. So when you look at the weights they were moving back then, and you keep in context, what they had access to as far as powerlifting gear was concerned, as well as equipment. We've got much better equipment nowadays. Back then you're looking at these pictures. These guys are using those really narrow, the benches with the really narrow racks, the squat stands that just have the little half curve on the top, not the upright that you can walk the bar into. So you're trying to target a really, really heavy squat when you rack those lifts. So it's pretty impressive. When you go back and look at some of the lifts they were doing, then even going back even further to the guys around the turn of the century like Hackenschmidt and Saxon and Sandow, and some of the feats of strength that they accomplished with no gear, no steroids, no special powders, pills, or supplements. I mean, it's pretty impressive. So I think the training is really a testament to what those guys accomplished. So I think it's really important to go back and kind of revisit what they did back then and see if there's anything that you can work in your programming nowadays, and just as always keeping an open mind. So hopefully you enjoyed this week's episode. If you've got any questions, comments, leave them in the comment section below. And of course, if you got any topic suggestions for future episodes, leave those in the comments section below. I know Doug has given me a couple things that he wants me to touch on, and I'll be getting into those here in a couple episodes too. So Doug, sorry I didn't cover any of the things that you suggested just yet, but we'll be getting to them soon. And as always, stay strong and stay healthy, and we'll check you next week.